All right, so I guess we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Tariq. I am Al-Shabaka's U.S. Policy Fellow. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to another episode of Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab series. So today we're going to be having an especially timely discussion on Israel's disinformation warfare tactics and how journalists are providing cover for Israel's genocide. We're now almost 7 months into this genocide. Israeli forces have killed over 34,000 Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, which is likely a conservative number, considering how many people remain missing. Israel has deliberately decimated Gaza's health infrastructure and destroyed much of the territory, leaving over 2 million people displaced. And over 14,000 children have been killed and thousands more injured or orphaned. And that's why describing Israel's assault on Gaza as unprecedented feels like an understatement. So 7 months into this, and we need to ask ourselves how this could go on virtually uninterrupted for so long, especially in the age of never again, at a time where social media allows information and footage to travel across the globe in seconds. And while public opinion around the world is increasingly turning on Israel, it's a painstakingly slow process. So there are two major obstacles to more substantial international intervention that we're going to discuss today. The first is the unprecedented flood of Israeli disinformation and propaganda that is specifically designed to justify their war crimes and dehumanize Palestinians. The second is the fact that journalists, predominantly Western journalists and corporate media outlets, have, instead of reporting accurately, continuously acted as eager spokespeople for the Israeli military. And they've uncritically regurgitated Israeli military claims without verifying them. They've actively silenced Palestinian voices, and they've even willingly agreed to have their reporting censored by the Israeli military itself. And the list goes on. We can forever. They've done all of this consciously or subconsciously to essentially manufacture consent for either outright support or tacit acceptance of Israel's genocide. So in this policy lab, I'm joined by Al-Arian and Abir Kopty, who will give their insight into the types of Israeli disinformation that we've been seeing, the ways in which journalists have uncritically promoted that disinformation and propaganda, and how that continues to effectively provide cover for genocide. Hopefully, we'll also be able to spend some time discussing what we can all do to navigate this environment. So Laila is an award-winning journalist, filmmaker, and executive producer of the Al Jazeera English documentary series Fault Lines. She's also the co-author of Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. Abir is an Al-Shabaka policy member and a journalist and writer based in Berlin. She holds a master's degree in political communication from the City University in London. And her political analysis has appeared in the Middle East Eye, TRT, The Nation, and other publications. She's also hosted and produced podcasts with South Podcasting, and she's the Samir Kasser Award nominee for opinion articles. So before we get into it, just a quick reminder about the format. I'll be posing questions for the first 40 or so minutes, and then we'll leave about 15, 20 minutes at the end to get to questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen. And remember, you can also vote on questions that come up if you find any particularly interesting or important. And we'll do our best to get to as many as we can with the time we have. So let's get started. Laila, I wanted to start with you. I know the list is very extensive, but can you give us some more illustrative examples of both the disinformation that Israel uses to justify their war crimes and how those specific claims have been uncritically regurgitated by Western and corporate media? What are some of the most common tactics that we've seen by them over the last 6 months?
Talking points coming out of. Sorry about that. My mic was muted. Shortly after October 7th, you see sort of two main talking points coming out of the Israeli military and government. We heard about how, we heard statements from Israeli officials, including the defense minister, saying that they were going to have a policy of siege of Gaza, obviously continuing the siege that had already been instituted on Gaza for the past 17 years, but that the people of Gaza would be subject to starvation, no food, water, fuel entering Gaza. So it was very clear from the very beginning that this was a war on the people of Gaza themselves, that this was a policy of starvation, of collective punishment. But you also heard a narrative of Hamas-ISIS. This was a narrative from the very beginning that Israel was really trying to get out there in the media in order to paint Hamas as, as ISIS, as these brutal, barbaric people committing mass murder for the sake of it. You heard a lot of justification of Israeli violence by saying that Hamas wanted to kill Israelis simply because they're Jews, so sort of evoking, the horrific legacy of the Holocaust. And you saw the media kind of take these narratives and run with them. So some of the examples, we're very familiar with them, but again, along the lines of the Hamas-ISIS talking point that the Israeli government was putting out was that Hamas beheaded babies on October 7th, that they put babies in ovens, and that they committed mass rape, that rape was actually weaponized as a weapon of war on October 7th. We also heard that Al-Shifa served as a command and control node, that UNRWA workers were part of these armed groups. And in fact, just today, we saw a report, an independent report commissioned by the UN come out that concluded that Israel has yet to provide any evidence substantiating its claim that UNRWA workers were part of armed groups. So what you see is these huge, sensationalist, sweeping claims made without providing any evidence. And you see the media not only run with them uncritically, but actually go wall to wall with them. So sort of go really big on the coverage. And I should say, I don't want to paint the entire Western media with a broad brush. We do see sort of exceptions to the rule. We see some really good and important investigations being done by a lot of these same outlets that I'm about to cite. But I would say some of the most prominent stories that we've seen, again, wall-to-wall, prominent coverage, breaking news alerts, all of that are essentially laundered from the Israeli government and military to the media to justify the ongoing mass killing of Palestinians. So, and part of that is also the omission of what's reported. So every single day, we see multiple stories from Gaza that if they were happening anywhere else, but especially if they were happening to Israelis, would merit wall-to-wall coverage. Everything from the horrific killing of Hind Rajab and her family, to reports of point-blank field executions, to white flag deaths that were literally caught on camera, to surgeries of children done on dinner tables without anesthesia, to Palestinians eating grass and animal feed, and so on and so forth. So what you have is the media running uncritically with unsubstantiated allegations made by the Israeli government to justify the ongoing killing, starvation, torture, jailing of Palestinians. And then you see an omission of these very important stories that, again, if they were happening to Israelis, if they were happening to Ukrainians by Russians, would merit wall-to-wall coverage. You also see the discrediting of the work of journalists in Gaza. So not only do we see a lack of solidarity from the media industry, especially the Western media industry, of these journalists in Gaza who've been targeted and killed, their families killed in record numbers that we haven't seen since the Committee to Protect Journalists has been collecting these numbers in the 90s. But you also see a silence, frankly, about the killing of and targeting of these journalists. You also see kind of a discrediting of their work. So sometimes you hear, even though the idea that Israel doesn't allow in journalists and hasn't allowed in journalists for 6 months, thereby cutting off any reporting outside of Gaza. Again, if another country was doing this, you would see a lot more outrage and conversation about it. But when it does come up, there's a sense of, well, there's no Western media covering it, so there's no objective journalism. So Palestinians are seen as unreliable narrators or chronicles of their own genocide, their own suffering. And then, of course, when the media is allowed in, it's only through, as you mentioned, military embeds. And even then, they have to be run across military censors, which, again, if another government was doing this, there would be a lot more outrage. And then you see, of course, an overwhelming focus on stories that are not of importance, frankly, compared to the genocide in Gaza. So you see a hyper focus on things like what chants people are chanting, the campuses and what's happening on campuses all over the country. So again, we see an over coverage of those stories and under coverage of the killing of Palestinians. And what that does is normalize the killing of Palestinians and makes it routine, makes it unremarkable. So the question is, what merits a breaking news alert and what doesn't merit it? Unfortunately, the process of normalizing the killing of Palestinians is to not make it breaking news, is to make it something that we should all just accept and be accustomed to.
Thank you, Laila. Abir, I wanted to get some thoughts from you, just because we often, when we're talking about media biases and the role they play in perpetuating this genocide, we often focus on the U.S. And we all know, obviously, the U.S. is Israel's biggest, most ardent supporter, and we focus mostly on the U.S. when we talk about pro-Israel biases. But in many ways, Europe, and especially in Germany, has seen similar scenes, if not worse, sometimes. Can you give us a little bit of a background on how this conversation has transpired in Europe and in Germany in particular, where you're living?
Yeah, thank you. So European or German media did not do any better than the American media. They are also under the echo. They do echo the Israeli talking points and the Israeli disinformation all the time. I think that what you've seen in the American media was pretty much similar in the European media, and I would say in the German media is even more wild, because I think probably German journalists think that no one reads them because it's in German, so they think they are allowed to violate every single journalistic decency or ethics in their reporting. There are so many examples that one can't even begin to cite, so many in German or in European media. But I think what is important to point out is that those examples are not isolated incidents of a failure or mistake or even malpractice. They are all part of a micro-level system of bias that it was not born in this genocide. It was, of course, it has been for a long time in the media. And I would say also, and it's important also to say these things, that this bias, especially against Palestinians and Arabs in general, is rooted in Islamophobic and racist attitudes. So it is not just that journalists are doing just echoing or doing malpractice of journalism. And they are not doing that because they have to, they are afraid of losing their jobs, etc. But I think these attitudes are deeply rooted in these journalists, and it's important to talk about these things. I think all this myth of independent and professional Western journalism has fallen apart during this genocide, as many other myths like, for example, that the international law applies to everyone. We've seen so many myths falling apart during this genocide. And if I can also point out how it's important also to understand that because it was not born today, it is important to know that this information practices that the Israeli government and the Israeli army is embedding in the European or Western media in general. It is a whole system of functioning, they function in a way. And it didn't start again now. There are at least 3 or 4 things that, talking points, that are deeply rooted in the Western media. That Israel, of course, worked on, disseminating them. Is that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, of course. Israel holds Western values. And Israel is under constant threat from the Arabs and Muslims, and therefore Israel and the victims. So these talking points are also the basis of all the disinformation campaign that Israel was working on during this genocide. So like the claim of that Palestinians are human, like Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields, tunnels under hospitals, this information about Hamas killing people, like we've seen in the Flower Massacre, that Israel warns people before they leave, that Hamas is ISIS, as Laila as well mentioned, and that they also use the Nazis, the right to defend itself, and that Palestinians are collateral damage, and also that every opposition to this genocide is depicted as anti-Semitism. So these are things that were echoed in the mainstream media, in the Western media all the time. Even 6 months, 7 months later, even when these journalists were called out, and so many people are doing this like great job in calling out these journalists, reporting, and there are so many reports, and many organizations did reports about the bias in the Western media, and they're still going on. So like this is unexplainable and unjustifiable. And if we can move quickly really to like quickly say that it's also important to note that it's not just what they report and what they do not report. It is also how they report these stories. What is the framing? What is the language they are using? Who are the sources they are relying on? How much space they give each source? Do they challenge the interviewees, especially if they are Israeli officials? Do they challenge them or not? How do they deal with the Palestinian interviewees, especially like we've seen in German media? There are hardly Palestinian interviewees, but when they are interrogated as if they were under Israeli intelligence interrogation. And of course, do you condemn Hamas is really wild in the German media. It is also what are the terms and words they are using. For example, in the European media, the terms like atrocities, massacres, slaughter were heavily used when we are talking about death of Israelis rather than Palestinians. There was always an underplay of the Palestinian suffer and underplay of the Israeli role. The use of confirm and claim when Palestinians claim but Israelis confirm, these are really like embedded ways of brainwashing people into whom to believe and what to believe and which information to take and to absorb and to digest. So it is really important to talk maybe in a later stage about how would we deal with this type of disinformation. But I would say that if I want to focus on German media, it is really not just the way or the story. It is very much how do they say these things, and beyond that, there are so much blatant and bold way like titles and articles. For example, one journalist, chief editor of one of the newspapers, wrote an article titled "God Bless the IDF." There is a very direct and blatant support of Israel's genocide in Gaza. It is not just that they are biased to Israel, it is actively, consciously supporting the genocide.
Thank you, Abir. I think it's interesting that you point to this deeply rooted system of bias. In many ways, a lot of this anti-Palestinian coverage speaks to, and the fact that in many ways it's just very much ingrained in the system and taken for granted. And I think this often makes it very difficult to identify that, if that makes sense, to like clearly identify it because it is presented in such deeply ingrained and subtle ways. So I think my next question is for Laila. Maybe we can dive into this a little bit more. But just in light of how much of this journalistic malpractice is deliberate and conducted in extremely subtle ways. For example, you get the God bless the IDF type content, but you also get much more subtle content and editorial decisions like describing Gaza's death toll as being as the numbers coming from the Hamas Run health ministry. and examples like that. Can you talk a little bit more about the specifically subtle ways in which the media has provided cover for Israel's war crimes, and how the impact of these like subtle tactics can often have, potentially more of a dangerous and damaging impact than the more overt than the more overt tactics and wording choices?
Well, the so-called Hamas Run Ministry of Health controversy, I think when historians and media analysts and researchers look back at this time, they're going to see these sort of waves of talking points and waves of controversies that are completely manufactured by the Israeli state, by Israeli PR consultants, the military, and again, sort of in lockstep with the media, which uncritically takes these PR, talking points and runs with it. So the so-called Hamas Run Ministry of Health controversy, that was around mid-October, shortly after Israel began its war on Gaza. And it was really amplified by a former Reuters journalist named Luke Baker. And then it sort of continued to escalate from there. We heard the president of the United States himself question Palestinian civilian casualties. And if you notice, all of these manufactured controversies all fall apart, but they've done their damage when they go viral. So once they fall apart, just like today, this independent report saying Israel has provided no evidence that UNRWA is a life-saving agency that provides aid to Palestinians. And when you cut off funding for it, you cut off aid to Palestinians. The damage to UNRWA and its reputation and to the people of Gaza has already been done. So they sort of have these talking points that get regurgitated by the media, that get a lot of coverage, that then fall apart months later when people aren't paying attention. But the more subtle ways, we saw The Intercept obtained a memo by the New York Times. I think just last week they published it, in which this memo, sort of instructed journalists to avoid using certain terms like occupied territories, like refugee camp. I think the reasoning behind refugee camp is that these are actually developed places, and we can't, even though like by international law they're considered refugee camps, these people by international law are considered refugees because they were forced out of their homes in 1948 with the creation of the state of Israel. Terms like ethnic cleansing, genocide. What the New York Times spokesperson told The Intercept is issuing guidance like this is to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance. So they've kind of convinced themselves this is how to be the objective journalist, when in fact all it does is actually serve Israel's interest to kind of muddy the waters of the narrative. It's not controversial that Israel has occupied Palestinian land, that there's an illegal occupation in the West Bank, that Gaza has been under siege for 17 years. So things that are actual facts become sort of muddied when you use language or when you restrict language. So, the US, and I think US journalists really pride themselves on independence, on not being like state sponsored or state funded. But when you have journalists themselves issue guidance that actually obfuscates, that muddies the waters, that makes it really unclear what the context is of the situation, then you are sort of adopting wholesale one country's narrative, that country being a country that's committing plausible genocide, as the ICJ said, that's been called an apartheid state by multiple respected human rights organizations, that's engaging in ongoing ethnic cleansing and mass killing and genocide of Palestinians. So you are taking a stance. So these American journalists that think themselves as objective, as really like following the rules of journalism, are in fact simply adopting Israel's narrative. The other thing that kind of goes with that is reporting October 7th as if it was like the beginning of time, when there was a record number of Palestinians killed in 2023 before October 7th. All of that is kind of decontextualized to paint October 7th as sort of the beginning of this war on Gaza, when in fact Gaza has been under siege, as I mentioned a lot of times, for 17 years. And what that meant was, coming with that is restricting the diet of Palestinians, resulting in even Israel controlling the calorie count of what went into Gaza, extremely high unemployment for the people of Gaza over those 17 years, going up to 70%. I can go on and on about what the situation of Gaza was like pre-October 7th. None of that context is included. So you also see a reliance on Israeli talking points, obscuring the fact that the Israeli military has misled journalists for decades. And not, if you think of a job of a journalist, you rely so much on sources. If a source has burned you time and again, that should raise questions of, should I continue relying on this source when they keep lying to me and burning me? So just as recently as 2021, the Israeli military held this whole press conference for journalists, including people like the Washington Post and NPR, and told them, we're going to do a ground invasion into Gaza. This was the 2021 war. They went and they reported it, the Washington Post, NPR, only for Israel to come back later and admit they were lying and that they were using these journalists as information warfare to take the Hamas fighters underground and then bomb those tunnels. So instead of journalists saying, wait a minute, we keep being lied to. They lied to us in 2021 about that. They lied to us about the circumstances in which the Palestinian legendary journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. And we saw all of that play out in real time. First, they said that she was killed by Palestinian fighters. They issued a video that was later debunked the same day by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem. Then they came back and they said, okay, she was killed in crossfire. Multiple investigations from the UN to the Washington Post to the New York Times to the AP to CNN, all of these places investigated, said an Israeli soldier was responsible for her killing. It was only after all of those investigations that they said, okay, fine, and a soldier likely shot Shireen, but it was unintentional. Now, how a sniper unintentionally shoots someone in the specific area between their helmet and their flak vest that happens to be exposed is beyond me. But all of this to say that Israel has a very long record of lying, of misleading, of obfuscating, and yet the U.S. and Western media in general rely so much on the Israeli talking points, including CNN having Israeli military spokespeople sort of as paid contributors, like contributing around the clock. You have, pro-Israel organizations or even sometimes Israeli government officials meeting with newsrooms to brief them and sort of give them their talking points. Again, rather than really approach them with skepticism, you see a wholesale adopting of that narrative. And then, of course, Abir mentioned this, just completely absolving Israel of any responsibility in the framing and headlines, especially of pieces. So we know that 40% of audiences actually don't read beyond the headline. So when headlines say things like the BBC, a 12-year-old girl in Gaza lost her family overnight. How did she lose her family? So they almost sound like riddles. The word Israel is frequently not there. Again, it's like they're almost going out of their way to absolve Israel of responsibility. We had the famous New York Times, and this was a piece that was supposed to be kind of humanizing people in Gaza, simply called Lives Ended in Gaza. And then you see, Abir mentioned this, the use of emotive language. So studies have been done by The Intercept, by Writers Against the War on Gaza, by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I encourage everybody to look these studies up that actually quantify how words, emotive, charged language, emotive words like massacre, horrific, and slaughter are overwhelmingly used to describe Palestinian actions and almost never to describe Israeli actions. So these are some of the subtle ways that frame and that sort of emerge in terms of some of this reporting. And I just want to conclude on this one very positive note, which is that it's not just journalists who are noticing this, it's regular people. People have become a lot more media literate, and they're noticing, and they feel completely gaslit, and they feel that what they're seeing in the mainstream Western sort of legacy media is completely contradicted by the streams of horrific videos that we're getting straight to our phones on social media from the ground in Gaza.
So I want to stick with you for one more quick add-on question. But so what in your opinion kind of explains this lack of learning among journalists? This refusal to treat Israeli claims with the added skepticism that it requires, despite the fact that they've been lied to so repeatedly, and especially when, like you said, people are becoming more conscious that conscious of being gaslit. And there is this wider decline in trust in these traditional sources of news anyways.
I think it's complicated. I would say some of it comes from the very top of how newsrooms are run and who runs newsrooms. So I think in the case of the New York Times, it's pretty clear that the executive editor, Joe Kahn, whose father actually served, and I don't like to say just because someone's father served on, this board means something, but it could give some insight into sort of his background and his thinking. But Camera is one of the groups that really tries to, pro-Israel groups, that tries to police reporting on Palestine and Israel in newsrooms and really kind of go after journalists that they see as being too pro-Palestine. So Joe Kahn's father, The Intercept reported, served on the board of Camera. But, putting that completely aside, you see just some of the choices. For example, the New York Times lack of admitting that their December 28th Screams Without Words article about alleged mass rape or Hamas's weaponization of rape during October 7th has completely fallen apart, completely been debunked. One of the most monumental, most embarrassing journalistic failures and examples of journalistic malpractice in my memory, refusing to correct that, refusing to apologize. And to say nothing of all of the other, sort of examples of just simply regurgitating Israeli talking points. So I would say some of it is ideological, people really internalizing the sort of pro-Israel perspective, whether they're conscious of it or not. I think a lot of it is unconscious bias. And I would say some of it is fear and sort of self-censorship, not wanting to, sort of rock the waters. People know that this issue you don't really rock the waters on unless you want to get fired, unless you want to get sort of castigated at work. We saw how the New York Times actually let go 2 writers for the magazine who signed a letter against the genocide in Gaza. But then just yesterday, a New York Times reporter with the New York Times name on her Twitter bio posted about how the protests on Columbia's campus are anti-Semitic. So you definitely see a double standard in terms of what mainstream journalists are allowed to say and what they're not allowed to say. And I think, like I said, I think some of it is self-censorship, some of it is fear, some of it is genuine, ideological alignment with Israel.
Thanks, Laila. Abir, I want to jump back to you, and I want to kind of step away from the day-to-day decisions of journalists themselves and kind of spend some time talking about Israel's total control of access to Gaza, the fact that they prevent journalists from entering without first agreeing to Israeli censorship measures, and they've also assassinated over 100 Palestinian journalists, making it increasingly difficult for Palestinian journalists from Gaza on the ground to get their perspective out to the world. Could you talk to us a little bit about how Israel's physical control of access and physical control of communications infrastructure have made it easier to spread Israeli disinformation and propaganda?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I think that's a very important thing also to keep discussing, because if you are if you're preventing journalists, I mean, this is every ordinary person will ask this question. If you're preventing journalists from going to Gaza and covering, then you have something to hide. And this is exactly it. I think Israel wants to control the narrative and wants to continue preventing foreign journalists from going to Gaza, but also wants always to cast doubt on Palestinian journalists who are doing really amazing job, tirelessly working under constant threat of being bombed and killed. Many of them were killed, as you mentioned, more than 100. Many of those who are still alive, their families were killed. They lost their families, lost their homes. Many of them are starved and dehydrated as well, and under constant threat, and they are still working tirelessly. I think Palestinian journalists set to the whole world a really example, a role model of how journalism is in war zones. And instead of really having this backing and embracement by the international journalist community, they are also treated as like as untrusted sources. I think it was Christian Amanpour that said in one of the interviews that, oh, there are Palestinian journalists, but we need independent Western journalists. And I think it sums it all. Like this whole myth, as I said in the beginning, that the Western journalists are automatically considered as independent. This is really a problem. Like if this is the concept we are dealing with, then it's really problematic. Palestinian journalists have done really great professional job reporting from Gaza. And they haven't been any support to them, any support whatsoever from the international media. And the other thing I would say, we know that Israel wants to control the narrative, and that's why it's preventing foreign journalists from being there. And we know that if foreign journalists would be there, like they were in Gaza during these, at least it was really critical in the first few weeks, because this is when the narrative was built. And the narrative that was controlled by Israel is justifying the genocide. So the presence of foreign journalists in Gaza would have made a change. Being on the ground, meeting people, seeing what's happening from the other side was going to influence whether they like it or not, whether they want it or not. It would have influenced the coverage in a way or another. And this might have influence also the narrative that was controlled by Israel. So it is important that this is not just the narrative, it is saving lives. Like the presence of the journalist would have made Israel think a little bit differently maybe about how it conducts its massacre. Not that it cares, because it bombed the foreign journalist headquarters in previous wars, but I mean still there would be a little bit of impact maybe on the way this war is conducted. The other aspect I think that is important to talk is what have foreign journalists and media institutions in the world did about this. I remember in the first few weeks there was an attempt to go to the Israeli court and appeal against this decision, and it failed. But other than this, there was no really significant pressure put on Israel. Those media institutions have powers. They can also have influence on their governments and make a lobby and put a pressure on Israel. But this deafening silence for 6 months, not putting pressure on Israel, knowing that this would save lives and would change the conduct of the war, and not doing anything, in my eyes, I think it is a sort of complicity. Only just recently, I think it was end of February, when more than 50 international, 6 months later, 50 international broadcast journalists signed an open letter to the Egyptians and the Israeli authorities to get a free access to Gaza. And only in April, the Foreign Press Association, FPA, released a statement requesting access to Gaza. Like 6-7 months later, you are just starting to raise your voices. I think this is a complete failure of the international journalist community that we should point out as well.
Thanks, Abir. I think on that note, I also want to stick with you to ask what we should be doing as the general public to navigate this world of basically media-approved Israeli disinformation, and what ways we can do to either leverage alternative sources of information or support Palestinian reporters and journalists on the ground. What are your thoughts on what the public can do?
Yeah, so it's important to start with saying that they are failing despite all this control of narrative, all this adoption of Israeli narratives in the foreign media, in the Western media. Despite all this silencing and trying to depict Palestinian or pro-Palestinian movement in a negative way, it is failing because people on the ground, and polls are proving this, even in Germany, with the whole really control, complete active pro-Israeli, pro-genocide coverage. Even in Germany, 70% of the people want this war to stop. So I think they are failing. And what people are doing now is working, like the sharing, the going to the direct source. People in Gaza are talking, are tweeting. They were our sources of information. And I mean, even foreign journalists, if they just want to do their job, even from remote, they could really rely on these sources and do due verification. They can do that if they just want, really have the intention to make a coverage. I think people are following and seeing the news live. Like what is happening in Gaza is broadcasted to millions of people across the globe live, and people, I think, just need to, as Laila said, people know where to find the information and people know how to read the information now. It is very important to scrutinize when we read the mainstream media. Very important to look there between the lines to see who are they quoting, how much lines they are giving each source, what are the terms and language they are using, what are the titles they are choosing. Are they really pointing out who did this crime, who kills, or they are just omitting the Israeli role? Or when they talk about kids starving, are they starving or starved? I mean, people should always scrutinize this, because I am sure so many people around the globe, they lost faith in the Western media. And it is important to continue reading them with really critical eyes and minds. But also to empower Palestinian sources. There are so many journalists on the ground. There are still tirelessly reporting. And through social media, you can always share their content, and you can amplify their voices. And you can support Palestinian sources of information and platforms. There are many of them. We can post links later on. And you can share. It is important to share information. This is the only way, since there is a control of the narrative and there is a silencing. It is important to share the information, not just watch the information, not just consume it, but also to share it with your friends, neighbors. It is important to share articles about context. I think it's really, so many people are educating themselves just during this genocide about what's happening in Palestine. And sharing information about context is very important as well.
Thanks, Abir. Laila, could you give us your thoughts as well before we go into Q&A session?
One thing I did want to say about, you asked about this sort of bias that journalists have. In early April, a piece came out in the New Yorker, and it was an interview with Aaron David Miller, he was a negotiator for the U.S. for many years, involving Israel-Palestine. So the interviewer asks him if he thinks that Joe Biden has the same empathy for Palestinians as he does for Israelis. And he says, Aaron David Miller, he says, "Do I think that Joe Biden has the same depth of feeling and empathy for the Palestinians of Gaza as he does for the Israelis? No, he doesn't, nor does he convey it. I don't think there's any doubt about that." And sadly, I think that extends to many journalists. I just think it couldn't be clearer. There's a deficit of compassion, of feeling for Palestinians, for their humanity. We've seen decades of demonization of Palestinians, and we can't underestimate the impact that has on society as a whole, but also on those shaping the news. I'll never forget when the beheaded babies, now obviously, of course, debunked, fake, fabricated story came out. So many journalists, the ones that we see on our TVs, on CNN, were tweeting. Abby Phillip, who's an anchor on CNN, tweeted, "Don't look away." Has she ever tweeted that about a single Palestinian child who was killed? No. And to me, that says a lot. That tells you everything. And she wasn't alone. This has happened time and again in the last 6 months. And it's very clear who these people that shape the news, that disseminate the news, who they think are worthy of humanity, of compassion, of grief and mourning, and who they think are not worthy of that. And I think that shapes, unfortunately, a lot of the coverage that we see.
Thank you both. I want to spend some time on some questions we're getting in from the audience, because there's a couple good ones. The first question we have is, how have Israeli disinformation and propaganda strategies shifted since October 7th? How do these changes relate to the traditional Hasbara doctrine? And how has social media, importantly, impacted this spread of disinformation? through either third-party pro-Israel influencers and NGOs. Do either of you want to take that question first?
Yeah, I can take it really briefly, because I think we have to pay attention to two things, I would say, in this regard. So many of the armies, like disinformation, or the Israeli Hasbara in general, disinformation campaign was really meant to divert attention from what's going. And if you follow the chronics of the chronicle development of this, you would see that almost every 2 or 3 weeks, there was one big lie or disinformation campaign happening, disseminated by the Israeli army about something. It was in the beginning the command center under the Al-Shifa. Later on, it was the rape story. Then it was the UNRWA workers. There was always and this is a way to maintain the justification for a genocide and divert attention from covering the genocide itself and the suffering of the Palestinians. And this is a strategy that was in place, and it's important to also pay attention to this pattern. The other thing is that this responding to every, if you notice as well, if we follow the pattern and see when there is a big story about a certain crime that the whole media is covering, because it starts on social media and then sometimes it really gets to the mainstream media, almost in every case of this, all of the sudden the Israeli army is investigating or looking into the case. And this is also another way to divert attention and to silence the international community, because unfortunately, and I really, as Laila mentioned, that if someone is lying to you and has done dozens of investigations that led to nowhere, and it has a history known as not holding accountable the army or officers, or soldiers or officers or officials, and you still believe that this investigation will lead somewhere, it's really, there is a problem. And I think what they do with this is silence international criticism. Like we've seen it with the killing of the World Central Kitchen. We've seen it in some certain cases. Also the Flower Massacre, I think, that they declare an investigation, but nothing happens. No one then, I really, where are the journalists who really want to do, even remotely, that you can follow up on these investigations? They never led anywhere. And this is also a way to silence criticism, because then the officials will tell you, and the journalists, we are waiting for the Israeli investigation to be finished. And that's another way to divert attention and to silence criticism. So there are many strategies in place that Israel is using in response to what's happening. I mean, they are adapting all the time, and they have this arsenal of strategies that they pulled it each time, depends on the situation and the international climate and the public opinion, etc.
And before Laila jumps in, I just want to highlight that I think that strategy of crisis hopping, hopping from crisis to crisis, is especially effective on social media, where attention spans are so thin. And I think like Laila mentioned earlier, where people don't read past headlines and don't stay for the time that these claims are eventually debunked, despite the fact that they're routinely debunked basically every time. Laila, do you have anything you want to add to that?
One thing I wanted to mention, which we didn't get to, is something that the Western media doesn't report, which even Israeli media has been reporting, which is the fact that on October 7th, it seems like, according to interviews with Israeli military officials, with witnesses, with Israeli soldiers, with even survivors, that the Israeli military was responsible for some of those deaths. Now, pick up a newspaper, watch CNN, you would never see any reference to that, even though that is now an established fact. So you also see a self-censorship of actually, you see sort of a disproportionate amount of coverage of October 7th compared to the last 6 months of ongoing mass killing of Palestinians and Palestinian civilians. But on the flip side, what you don't see is an actual rigorous, honest, authoritative coverage of that day that includes the reality that the Israeli military was responsible for some of those deaths. In addition to that, I think we did talk about how social media is this sort of bright spot in an otherwise dismal media environment. But what's really troubling is the fact that these tech companies are being influenced by sort of pro-Israel pressure, or themselves pro-Israel, in terms of shadow banning accounts, in terms of just unilaterally removing the accounts of Palestinians or Palestinian journalists. We see this massive pressure campaign happening even from Congress to ban TikTok. In the US, TikTok obviously has been a very important space to kind of get the truth and the reality of what's happening in Gaza to people. So I think people should definitely watch out for what's happening in the social media space and the power and control that tech companies have to limit the scope of the conversation, to limit the scope of the news and the reporting on the ground in Gaza.
Yeah, I actually want to maybe spend a little bit more time on that, just because what I've been kind of grappling with now is that, one of the potentially, you could call it, silver linings of this declining trust in corporate news and more traditional news sources is that it opens people up to the opportunity to get their news from alternative sources. Obviously, there are many downsides to that, but one of them being this crackdown by companies like Meta and now the focus on TikTok. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you kind of, I guess, predict this this balance between where people get their news from and how this is going to impact people's views on Palestine? Laila, maybe we could start with you and then go to Abir.
Well, a recording was released of Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL where he said, our crisis is really generational. They're really panicked about young people becoming a lot more critical of Israel because of what they're seeing on social media, because of this sort of, there's no longer a reliance on legacy media to get their news, to get their framing of what's happening in Palestine. As Abir mentioned, so many people have really started looking into the history of the occupation and really learning and sort of even deprogramming in some cases some of the propaganda they were subjected to when they were younger. So I think there is a concerted effort by pro-Israel groups to limit what's on TikTok. And you hear this not only from organizers, from advocates, from members of Congress, usually right-wing, but also some Democrats as well. But you also hear this from, people who just say, well, my kids are just watching, they frame it as misinformation or disinformation, which is so comical. It's sort of an example of how the world is turned upside down on this issue. But they call any kind of story about what's happening in Gaza, the reality of what's happening, the mass killing of people, which is all factual, misinformation, disinformation, akin to like QAnon, which of course it isn't. But I think it's troubling. I mean, let's wait and see what happens with TikTok and how they're going to try to really limit the scope of what people can see there. But I think so much of what happened in the last 6 months is the West, whether it's media or governments or human rights advocates, that mask really of liberalism really falling. And people seeing the hypocrisy for what it is. You can't claim to be a proponent of free speech. You can't condemn or berate or talk down or preach to other countries and lecture them about human rights, about free speech, about free press, when you don't uphold those very values on this issue.
Yeah, I can just echo what Laila was saying. And I would say that the jinn is outside of the bottle. I don't think they can control our minds anymore, especially with the younger generation. And I truly believe that there are so many brilliant minds out there that they were doing amazing job recently to expose Israeli crimes and disseminate information, etc. And I think there are so many brilliant minds that they will come up with different initiatives. It is important to build also our own initiatives of independent media. There are many out there, we can support them, but also try to really be prepared for a moment that they will start censoring more massively the voices on social media. But I think they cannot control it anymore. I think that's why they are freaking out. The jinn is outside of the bottle, and there is no way back from this from the moment, like from the whole these few months, which was really like a life-changing event, if I may say, like that this genocide is a really catalyst of so many things, has so many things, like so many myths has fallen apart, so many people are changing, and I think there is no way back. Whether, no matter what they do, I think there is a younger generation that is really realizing the things Laila mentioned. I don't want to repeat, but I am really hopeful. I think this is our only hope, if anything.
Well, before we sign off, since we have just a couple minutes, it looks like somebody threw in one additional question. Just in terms of, other than social media, what other alternative news sources would you recommend that range from like The Intercept to Democracy Now? Are there other platforms that you could suggest to our viewers, and what would you suggest they kind of invest in as alternative sources of information?
I would say, I mean, my network, Al Jazeera, has done incredible reporting. They're sort of, I think, the largest news organization on the ground in Gaza. Both the Arabic channel and the English channel have really put forward some incredible reporting, whether it's breaking news or investigative journalism out of Gaza. The English channel, a lot of people don't know this, but it's like free to stream on YouTube. So all you have to do is just go on YouTube, type in Al Jazeera English or Arabi if you speak Arabic, and you can stream it for free. It's easy. There's no, sort of, for now, there's no paywalls or anything like that, or the US government hasn't managed to block it yet in the US, although sometimes YouTube has blocked some of our content for being too graphic. But yeah, I would say definitely support Al Jazeera. Democracy Now! Obviously has covered this, for decades in a way that others haven't. People mentioned The Intercept. I think there's a lot of different publications. And this is an important point, actually, given the pressure campaigns that pro-Israel groups have on anything remotely sympathetic to Palestinians. I would say one important thing is, if you do see a good story in, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post that humanizes Palestinians, that exposes Israeli war crimes, write a letter. Contact the editors, because that's what they are doing this day and night. So it's important that they also hear positive feedback when you do see those pieces that are important and illuminating.
Yeah, I would say also same goes if you see a negative reporting, also take an action. We can do a lot. We also have power to, like, cancel subscription, send a letter, make your voice loud. I think this is also important. If you have that, like, I know people are doing so many things. So if you have the energy and have the time, it doesn't take a lot of time. Just, send a letter, call, or just cancel subscription. Yeah, so I think Laila mentioned most of the platforms. I mean, if you are on social media, then AG Plus as well is doing a lot of stories, but also like IMEU in the US, and so many. There are, I can't, like, it's not, but there are, like, look for organizations also that are doing reporting, like pro-Palestinian organizations that are doing reporting, facts, etc. So that's also important too. And like, when you see like those stories, also like try to share them, because of the shadow banning, because of the censorship. It is important to empower the voices that are documenting and making stories about what's going on, so their stories maintain, like, stay visible to others. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. It looks like we're just out of time. But before we sign off, I just like to remind everyone that these policy labs are a crowdfunded program of Shabaka, so we'd be obviously very thankful for any contributions you can make. And if you are able to donate, please do so by clicking the donate button that should appear somewhere on your screens below. And thank you again, Laila. Thank you, Abir. Thank you for everyone for taking the time to join us today and think about these important topics. And hopefully we can use this advice moving forward and operate in this in this confusing world of information warfare.
Thank you.
Thank you.